Let's get started with Chapter 2 on state constitutions. The first question is how state constitutions differ from the national constitution. And let me talk about that a little bit. Here are some characteristics of state constitutions as compared to the national constitution. For one, they're longer. They're much longer. One of the things that makes the national constitution interesting and unique is that it's short and it doesn't really say much, and that's how it gets to be adopted. But at the state constitution, it's like basically the state officials are not trusted by the constitution writers, and so what they tend to do is try to spell everything out so they don't have a lot of power or control over making laws. State constitutions contain specific laws. A lot of times what you find in state constitutions are special rights given to interest groups, particularly one of the classic groups that's identified in the state constitution are farmers. But it goes on with like farmers and lawyers and bankers and so on, where they're given special privileges. Farm bills are nothing but special privileges, and a lot of times that stuff is written into the law. It's harder to amend state constitutions than it is the national constitution. Oftentimes, what happens is that the legislators go about trying to amend the Constitution because there's some kind of basic limitation, like, for example, maybe in their distrust, the people who wrote the Constitution limited the amount of money, say, that judges can make. And so they go to amend it so that they can give them a wage that's comparable to what should go on in more modern times. Maybe they did this back in the 50s or so on, and that salary isn't enough for 2018. So what happens is they go about trying to change it. They can't really do it. The amending the Constitution becomes too difficult. I remember, for example, in Illinois when there was a women's right amendment that was proposed, and it went on for years and it never got passed. But anyway, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll wind up changing the whole Constitution if the issue that they're trying to amend is serious enough. Another thing, of course, is less flexible. That's sort of inherent in everything I've said so far. The national Constitution is very flexible because the Supreme Court, the President, and Congress are really changing it all the time. There's something called the unwritten Constitution, which allows these institutions to change. For example, at the national level, the Constitution gives most power to the Congress. Congress can declare war and has power over the money and so on and so forth. But in practice, over the years, what's happened is that the president has become the dominant branch, and that's because they just kind of changed the Constitution by practice. That's what we call the unwritten Constitution. And you can't do that at the state level. It's just too spelled out in terms of restricting power and in terms of spelling out what institutions, president, the governor, legislature, and courts can do. Another thing that's very different is the state constitution provides for local government. So what you wind up having is that there are all kind of provisions in there that limit what local governments can do. Essentially, what has happened, or what the structure of government is at the state and local level, is that local government's not really independent. There is something called home rule, which gives cities like Chicago the opportunity to operate on their own without control from the state. But in essence, they really don't have fundamental power. um, inherent power. They just have what the states allow them. And they have to write that out and spell it all out as to what local governments, and not just cities, but counties and special districts and all the rest, what they have and what powers they have and what limits they have on those powers. And all of that takes a lot of space and makes the Constitution much longer than it would be at the national level, where only the states and the national government are recognized in the national Constitution. The length of the Bill of Rights is another thing at the state level. That would be bigger too, because a lot of times they add rights in. For example, minorities get rights that you wouldn't have at the national level, like, for example, gays or other people of color and so on that haven't been identified, can be identified in newer state constitutions, and they'll often do that. Rights of individuals as well, like putting in the right to die, assisted suicide or assisted death or whatever you call it. Things like that are making the state Bill of Rights much longer. And then the last thing is there's restrictions on governmental power. So all the levels, especially the governor and the legislature, are limited in what they can do. The governor of a state kind of pretends that he's like the president at a lower level, but that's really not true. And the legislature is very limited in what they can do as well. So it's not like national politics where the president does pretty much whatever he wants, and the governor is limited in almost every state, much more so. There's almost no real comparison these days between a governor and the president. The second question is, what's direct democracy and how is it utilized? Well, there's three components of direct democracy: initiative, referenda, and recall. The initiative is essentially a way for citizens to introduce legislation. So all of these things, initiative, referendum, and recall, came out of the reform movement of the early 20th century. And they didn't really take hold at the national level, but they certainly did take hold at the state level. So what they were trying to do is initiate ways for the citizens to participate more directly in politics. And what they wanted was to kind of end corruption and end legislators giving special favors to interest groups and so on. They were trying to stop all that. It was very naive, I think. But anyway, these are the methods that they used. One was the initiative, where all of these things, all three things, take a petition. You have to start. They all start with a petition, and if you get enough signatures, and you could put something on the ballot. So, for example, like you might want, we've seen things like marijuana laws. Those marijuana laws oftentimes were started by something like that, an initiative. So if you get enough signatures, and usually it's a lot, and then they have to be verified, and it goes through a long process, then the proposal, whatever the proposal is, will go on the ballot. Referenda is usually what that usually means, and I'm simplifying this a little bit, but what the referenda usually means is that the legislature can't just pass bills on their own. They have to put the statement on the next ballot, and it has to be approved by a majority of the voters. So usually that happens, and you can see it happen at the local level too, where what happens is that the whenever there's like an effort to do a tax increase of any kind, whether it's for schools or roads or anything else, they will have to put it on the ballot and allow the voters to approve it. Especially another good example of that would be when whenever they propose a pay increase or benefits increase to legislators, and it has to be approved by the voters. And then the recall is the where you can end the term of a executive or legislator or judicial person earlier than the end of their term. So if the public doesn't like what a governor's doing or a judge is doing or a member of the legislature, they can have a recall election. So what that simply means is that you get enough signatures on the ballot, that person has to stand for election again. And usually if you get that big a number of signatures, the person just resigns and they hold a new election. So anyway, those are some of the basic things. Here's the arguments for and against term limits. The first one would be pro-term limits. And term limits, of course, mean that a person can't just keep running forever. At the national level, of course, they don't have term limits. And we just saw the other day in the news that Warren Hatch decided to resign from the Senate. And, you know, he's been there forever. I mean, I remember him when he was a relatively young man, and now he's in his 80s and, you know, can barely stand up. And yet he's been running all these years. So he finally decided to end it, but he didn't have to. He could have just kept going. John McCain is another person. He's got that horrible brain cancer, and he's still going, and he's not resigning or anything. So what term limits would do, it would make them resign. It would usually the number of years that they're required to, you know, when they're required to run is not, it's not short. You know, it's not like 1 or 2 terms. It's usually like 12 years or 10 years or something like that. So it's quite a bit of time. But anyway, here are the arguments that would first of all be in favor of term limits. One would be that they're not doing their job, so we need to replace them. The second one is that incumbents have an unfair advantage. And in other words, basically what they're talking about is raising money. Incumbents can use their time in office to do fundraising. So, you know, they're collecting a salary and they can do fundraising, whereas a challenger has to be a private citizen, and anytime they put in on campaigning or fundraising or anything else in the effort to get elected, they have to do it on their own time and their own money. So it's much harder. And also, of course, interest groups, the primary source of money, are giving their money primarily to incumbents because incumbents have won in the past, and it's sort of like betting on a favorite. So if you're an incumbent, you have a tendency to raise a lot more money. And then, of course, if legislation comes up, like, for example, the state might decide that it wants to do a lottery or it wants to do casino gambling or something like that, then what happens is that the legislators start pumping a lot of money into the incumbents so that they'll vote for the lottery or the casino or whatever it is. Another argument, of course, is that if you favor term limits, you have term limits, then interest groups will be less influential. Newer people who don't have to stay in office, aren't career politicians, will supposedly be less influenced by what interest groups try to say and do to them. The next one is they're less likely to have career politicians. So some people, particularly the people that advocate term limits, don't like the idea of career politicians. They want to see politicians as sort of citizen politicians, where you serve a couple of years and then you leave. And then the last argument for term limits is there's less chance of corruption. The argument would be that people would be less likely to be corrupt if they're not going to stay there. I hope you understand those things. If not, give me send me an email or something and let me know. The other side, the people who are against term limits, argue these things. that when you have term limits, you kick out good legislators. Second one is that experience makes experts. That if the only way to really learn the job is on the job, and if you're there for 10 or 12 years, then you really become good at it. And if you become good at it, then in essence, there's no reason why the public wouldn't want to keep you in office. They also know how to get things done. When experience leads to the ability to get things done. Another argument is that if the public wants to re-elect incumbents, then they have a right to do so. And the last one is that the do-nothing legislators is an exaggeration. Legislators and usually do something, otherwise the government would stop. And so they're always being accused of doing nothing, but like it says, it's an exaggeration. Okay, the last one is what kind of issues are decided by the initiative. And we started to talk about the initiative. That's the method whereby the voters can put something on the ballot after they get a big enough voters to sign a petition, so they can get something on the ballot. Well, what kind of things get on the ballot? Here are some examples. Issues the legislature will not pass. Fracking, that method, awful method of mining. Animal welfare. There was a law, for example, passed in Colorado, and I believe another one in California, that applied animal welfare laws to farm animals. So far, farm animals are exempt. So you can hold a pig in a confined area where it can't move around, it can just stand up and lay down when that pig is pregnant. There's no room to move around. And you could do that and you get away with it. You couldn't do that to a dog, but you could do that to a farm animal. And so anyway, that's what the law said. It said that welfare laws apply to farm animals. I don't think in either state that it really got anywhere, because oftentimes they put these things in the future. They look better than they are. They put them in the future, and then that gives the legislature time to change the law. Stem cell research is another kind of thing. The government at the national level refused to get involved in it during Republican administrations because it's seen as a kind of byproduct of abortion. And so states have decided to get involved because it may have some potential for curing illnesses and other kinds of problems that people, especially when they get older, experience. So that's one kind, issues that the legislature will not pass. Another thing is laws favored by the public. A lot of times, if you look at public opinion polls, you can see that the public has a different view about things than legislators do. Assisted suicide, death penalty, term limits, tax reform. A lot of times, the public, in terms of public opinion polls, they're in favor of these things, and the legislature just doesn't do anything. So that's another area where initiative is used. Laws limiting the power of interest groups, farm bill reform, lobbying laws, those kind of things. Again, the legislature refuses to deal with it, and so oftentimes in states it gets on the ballot. And the last example I'm using here, and there are others, laws limiting the legislative power, conflict of interest laws, salaries, and corruption. All of those things the public sees as the legislature's refusal to do them because they benefit the individuals who are in the legislature. So oftentimes those kind of things will get on the ballot. Some states, like ones that I would consider like reform states, have used that method, like in Wisconsin, to make some fundamental changes that you don't have in most states. And then the last thing I put down here is a website where if you click on it, you can see a whole series of examples of initiatives and how they're being used.